And welcome back on behalf of my colleagues at India by the Bay and Asia Society Hong Kong Center, our sponsors and partners. Welcome to our first virtual edition of India by the Bay, Hong Kong. Initially, the 6th India by the Bay 2020 edition had been planned, as you know, for the month of February. Due to the pandemic, the main on-ground edition has now been moved to 2021, but we promise you we're going to make every effort to be there. However, our determination to support the arts and bring India's vibrant culture to Hong Kong annually prompted us to go the digital route, with the belief that even as cities and countries are shutting down their borders all around us, it is imperative that the flow of cultural ideas and knowledge is not constrained. And it's really with this intent that we decided that we would do this digital series in partnership with Asia Society Hong Kong Center and with all of you. Our first session in this series is Wellness, Yoga as a Way of Life. And what better way to start this series in these very interesting times. With Daniel Simpson, a yoga philosopher who will present a specially designed session on the benefits of yoga during lockdown. Daniel Simpson is a yoga philosopher and an author of The Truth of Yoga, a comprehensive guide to the history of practice. His approach combines scholarly knowledge with the all-important humor and insight, making yoga philosophy accessible and relevant to practitioners today. Daniel teaches courses online at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, at Triyogya in London and around the UK and internationally. Drawing on a master's degrees from SOAS University of London and 2 decades of experience, he aims to help students explore their own path. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Daniel Simpson. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this first session. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Sit back and relax. That's a great introduction. Considering that for a lot of people in the modern world, the word yoga evokes the idea of tying yourself up in knots, a little bit like the chap on the slide I'll be showing you in a moment. It's not really what we're going to be doing today. We're looking at yoga as an integrated system, in a way, an approach to the world, a way of understanding who we are, and therefore a way of sidestepping some of the things that life throws at us, perhaps not getting so caught up in them. Even the ones we can't change, like the requirement to sit indoors or to withstand whatever hardships the quarantine situation related to the pandemic has thrown at us. So I'm going to dive in and take a little look at all these things by way of a presentation. So I'll start sharing some slides now, and we'll slowly make our way through yoga as a way of life. So hopefully you're now seeing the chap on his way to contorting. He hasn't thankfully got his head wrapped between his legs, which could be the next phase. We're not going there. We're going somewhere a lot simpler. We're just going to sit where we are for a couple of minutes. I think it's important, first of all, as I was saying, to acknowledge that yoga isn't all about contortions, about postures. It's a way of inhabiting our bodies without getting caught up in our bodies, settling into ourselves so that we can see beyond the things that preoccupy us in our minds. So I'm just going to invite you, wherever you are, whether you're sitting on the floor, on a chair, reclining in a sofa, wherever it may be, just settling into the posture that you're in right at this moment. Descending into the body. We spend a lot of time up here in the mind. Instead of thinking about being in the posture, just descending awareness into the heart, feeling the body where it is, supported, as I say, either on a cushion, on a chair, on the floor, just feeling the body there. If it helps to close your eyes so that you can take your awareness into that feeling in the body. It's not an idea, so it's really important just to let go of trying to even observe it, just feeling it. Feeling the body in the space, settling, softening, feeling the flesh, the muscles around the bones, just releasing, a comfortable posture. That's really the definition of the posture for yoga practice. Settling into the body, feeling it as one. Now, of course, when we sit still and close the eyes, other things happen. The mind comes along and throws up thoughts. But see if while we're sitting here we can just allow those thoughts to come and go, not grasping after them, not pushing them away. Just letting things come and go as they are, here, now, in the body, settling downwards into the support. And as we slowly draw the mind into the body, becoming aware of a stillness behind all of the things that go on in the mind. If we can feel that stillness within us, perhaps starting to notice that the breath arises out of that stillness and dissolves back into it. Perhaps even seeing that thoughts arise out of that stillness, dissolving back into it also. Whatever's happening, just sitting now for a moment in silence, letting things come and go as they are, leaving everything just as it is. Gently, if you've had the eyes closed, slowly opening the eyes. Coming back into the space where you are. Just allowing the body to settle. If anywhere is tense, just shaking it out a moment, and we'll have a little chat about some of the ideas behind what we were just doing. Really, the important message of yoga as a way of life, rather than about the physical practices that we're more familiar with, is that it's something that's accessible in any situation. It's an approach to the world. I've got here on the screen a depiction of a scene in one of the most famous yoga texts, the Bhagavad Gita, and that's set on a battlefield of all places. The idea being really that if it's not possible to access this clarity, this stillness within us, even in the greatest adversity, then these teachings aren't much use. So this year, 2020, has been full of challenge. The pandemic and all of its consequences, economic, perhaps also personal in terms of our circumstances, our limited ability to interact sometimes, except through the screen, which can be quite agitating in and of itself. Lots of ways in which we've been challenged, quite apart from everything else that's going on in the world with environmental meltdown and all of the various ways in which inequality is challenging us as a species. So yoga, in the face of all of this, is offering a way of actually confronting it, looking it in the eyes, being able to be with it, and yet at the same time not be controlled by it. That's the message of the Bhagavad Gita. It starts with a chapter entitled The Yoga of Despair, and it goes from there to ultimate liberation. So there is hope, is the basic message to start with. In the Gita, it's also explained, though, that a lot depends on our orientation. It's possible to become one's own worst enemy as well as one's own best friend. So the practice of yoga in many different ways, as we were just really exploring, by just settling into the body, not trying to make it be anything other than what it is, even perhaps just sitting there with discomfort if it's there. That's a way of making friends with ourselves, giving ourselves the possibility in a way of seeing differently. The alternative is to be constantly at war with the world, at war with our experience, wanting it to be something other than what it is. And in that way, the Bhagavad Gita says, this is when one has lost oneself. This very self acts like an enemy. So again, many different ways. There's these two alternatives that the yogic tradition is suggesting we're confronted with. We have to make a choice which path we're following. Ultimately, that's a way of untangling ourselves. Although, of course, as we've just observed, there is the possibility of tightening the knots that we force ourselves into. I'm not going to suggest that we attempt this perhaps photoshopped version of postural yoga, but there's a message behind it in the old yoga texts. It's said in many different ways that there is something knotted within us that has to be unwound if we're to experience our fuller potential in life, and also to understand what it is that causes us to suffer. So again, in different ways, the practice of yoga is about undoing that knot. It's said in the Mahabharata that that's actually in our hearts. If we unwind that knot, the greatest happiness can unfold. And that's really the message of all of the different traditions that talk about yoga. I should emphasize that this is not something confined to what we nowadays know as Hinduism. The yoga traditions derive from a really uncertain source way back in the past, and there are many crossed paths where different ideas have been exchanged between a whole variety of traditions. The Buddhist tradition, the Jain tradition, the yoga tradition. They're perhaps the best known of these, but there are others who we don't really hear from anymore because they didn't leave texts in the way that these ones I'm quoting here on this slide have been handed down to us. And they've all got the same message. They came into being, these various ways of describing the practice of yoga, through a search to transcend the problem of suffering. That's expressed very clearly in the Bhagavad Gita as a definition of yoga. Yoga is to stop this problem of suffering. The Yoga Sutra, another very influential yoga text about the philosophy of yoga and also the meditation practice that it describes, says our aim as practitioners is to avoid suffering. And as you may well be familiar from the Buddhist tradition, the idea of suffering is really the root of the teaching. There is, however, hope. There may be suffering, but there is also another noble truth, one of the Buddha's four sort of foundational teachings. There is this problem of suffering, but there is also a way of identifying what causes it, a way of actually causing it to stop, and then a series of practices one can implement to make that possible. And in their various ways, all of these different traditions that borrow ideas from one another and at the same time diverge, present their ideas slightly differently. This common theme, dukkha, the Sanskrit term meaning suffering, it's said to be in some ways inescapable. It's the nature of things. It literally means, if you break down the word, bad space, and that's pretty much 20th century jargon. I'm in a bad place. We've all experienced that. I mean, the original, I guess, implication of it was related to the space on a wheel in which the axle inserts. And if you've got a bad space, your ride through life is pretty bumpy as your axle jumps around in the wheel space. A good space on the other side of things, sukha, is the path to happiness, gliding effortlessly through whatever life might be throwing in front of our path. So all of these different traditions are dealing with these two concepts, sukha and dukkha. So the way out of suffering to happiness, but happiness conceived slightly differently to how we might think of it today. And we're going to explore what that looks like in a moment. But first, given that the Buddha is often associated with a phrase, life is suffering, I thought it would be helpful to see what he actually says. If you go to the Pali Canon, the original sort of summaries of his early discourses, the Buddha explains that many things in life are suffering. We experience suffering in all sorts of ways. To be born is to experience the possibility of suffering. To get old means we suffer. To get sick, to die, ultimately, obviously, is suffering. Pain, grief, unhappiness, all these things that we associate with the word suffering, obviously. But now comes the key, being united with what is not liked, being separated from what is liked, and fundamentally not to get what one wants is suffering. So it's partly to do with our orientation towards the world. To want things to be a certain way, we suffer because we're not prepared to take life at face value and respond to it with skill in the moment. Instead, we're berating it for not being what we wanted it to be. And if we turn to the Yoga Sutra, which is very much influenced by the same strand of teachings, those two main points are the top two branches of the tree, raga and dvesha, the twin sort of expressions of the same tendency, grasping after the things that we want, attachment to them, craving them, aversion, trying to push away the things that we don't like, trying to control our whole experience so that we don't have to endure the things that we find distasteful and that we can maximize the enjoyment of the stuff we like. In the Yoga Sutra, this sort of twin track problem is expanded a little bit to the right. There is this other problem that the ultimate craving is to stay alive forever, abhinivesha, not to wish to die, averse to death. So this sort of twin bundle of craving and aversion there in its most extreme form. It says in the text actually that afflicts even the wise. It's a natural human tendency to not want to die. However, we suffer if we really attach ourselves to a mistaken idea of who we are, which is the left branch of the tree, asmita, this experience of beingness, I amness, ego, a personal identity, seeing the whole world in terms of how is stuff affecting me? Have I got what I want? Have I managed to avoid the things that I didn't want? Am I gaining? Am I losing in relation to other people? The whole of our suffering, in a way, can be grounded in this root of the tree, ignorance, misunderstanding the way things are. We experience life as people. We have a personal identity. I'm here talking to you. There's already a sense of separation and me-ness in that very statement. But life itself is something subtler than that. And the yoga tradition is trying to unwind our sense of who we are back beyond this point where we personalize everything, telling a never-ending story of me and my life and whether I feel happy about it or not, to say there's something subtler behind that whole way of looking at the world, an experience of just perceiving things as they are. And in that space, there's this possibility of choice. Do we get more tangled up in the mess? Do we find a way of unknotting ourselves? And the Bhagavad Gita is pretty stark in the way that it describes the problem. This problem is desire, effectively, and the desire that causes us to suffer is said to be like an insatiable fire. It burns in us intensely. It drives us forward endlessly, gripping onto the things that we think will bring us happiness. And the Gita explains this is because we're thinking of the world as something outside of us that gives us satisfaction. The objects of the senses, so through our vision of things, our taste of things, our hearing of things, our interaction with the world through the senses, we inevitably get attached to the things that we like and experience aversion for the things that we don't like. And from this desire, we get the problem of anger when we don't get things to be the way that we want. The anger confuses us, and then we're in no position to deal with the world and what it throws at us. Instead, we're this bundle of rage waiting to unleash our feelings on social media, or kicking the cat, as the proverbial expression in English goes. Instead, yoga is saying there's something we can do about this. We can actually rewind that process a little bit and start to behave a little bit more skillfully. The Bhagavad Gita puts it this way, it's a strong message, it's a challenging message. Yoga is challenging, it's challenging our assumptions about the world, it's asking us to reframe how we see things. It says, one who is able to endure here, in this very world, in this body, the agitation that arises from desire and anger is one absorbed in yoga. That is a happy person. Well, happiness sounds good. To have yoga defined in that way, though, is already a different thing. Yoga is not the adoption of a particular posture or a particular practice. It is to be able to withstand desire, to be able to let desire flow through us without getting so agitated that we express those more negative tendencies that come from our frustrated desires, usually wanting the world to be other than it is. That's what yoga is dealing with. That's the fundamental message. So we're brought back to this question all the time. What is yoga? Yoga is so often misrepresented in the modern world. Not really, through anybody's particular fault, but it's become associated with the performance of a sequence of postures in a room for, say, 60, 90 minutes, perhaps with a soundtrack. And that approach to stretching in the body can feel good. That's, there's no harm in it. But we go back to these early texts that I've just been flashing up. They don't talk about doing anything other than what this impressively dreadlocked chap on screen right now is doing, sitting, looking inwards, trying to disentangle this interaction we have with the world through the senses, trying to understand who we are behind all of that, trying perhaps even to step back beyond the mind, just to witness everything that unfolds so that we can then, from that position, respond to the world with more skill. And it's said in one of those early texts, the Yoga Sutra, talking about 1600 years ago maybe that was written down, but summarizing maybe 1,000 years of teachings before that, that yoga is both what we do and the outcome of doing it. Yoga is to be known as yoga. Yoga arises from yoga. One who is therefore vigilant by means of yoga delights in yoga for a long time. So there is something we can do that enables us to experience that capacity to withstand what life throws at us. That's the fundamental message. But at the same time, yoga can't really be pinned down. It's a whole orientation of ourselves to the world that ultimately involves letting go of the idea of ourselves, even being able to just be rather than be me in this story of me and my life. And that's what's said in the Bhagavad Gita, but the fruit of that is not to become a non-person or to detach from the world and live in a cave. It's to be able to actually stay in that mindset and carry on with life, perform actions, having abandoned attachment. Attachment being desire, the problem of craving, clinging to things, and therefore having become indifferent to success or failure. Now, again, that doesn't mean not doing anything. It means being able to do things without needing them to deliver particular results, doing them for the pure love of doing them, or for the fact that they are the thing that needs to be done. It is therefore said that evenness of mind is yoga. So the capacity to act in that way is identified with this word equanimity in English, really. This steadiness of mind, this capacity to not be pulled in any direction by the desire for the world to be a particular way. The same sort of description is actually applied in the Yoga Sutra to how one should sit. The posture that one adopts, it should be steady and comfortable. But as I was articulating when we were just sitting at the beginning, the way we get steady and comfortable is not to sit up straight, ramrod with a spike up the backside. It's to relax into the body, to absorb ourselves in the infinite space and silence within us, so that one's not pulled by dualities. And these dualities of the opposites, they are, those tendencies, the craving and aversion, the desire for things to be a certain way, the desire to avoid them to be things that we don't like. The tendencies also, therefore, of happiness and unhappiness. Beyond even that, just being able to be in the moment. It's therefore said, obviously, that yoga is something other than twisting the body. It's a way of training the mind to be able to stay in that state. And we go to the Mahabharata, which is the great epic within which the Bhagavad Gita is contained. There are many ways one can practice yoga, it says, but really the one that's most effective is meditation. So in all the different forms of early yoga, we're really talking about meditation, but meditation is subtle. And it's said even here, once we've defined meditation as being the most powerful, there are different ways of approaching it. Effectively, it says, if you really want to drill it down to the narrowest focus, you can either do something that concentrates the mind, or you can control the breath as a way of controlling the mind. And those are the two fundamental practices that make it easier to see the world in a different way. The logic for this is explained in an even earlier text, the Chandogya Upanishad, one of the earliest Upanishads from more than 2,500 years ago. And it makes this rather strange sounding comparison. Just as a bird that's tied by a piece of string to its leg is capable of flying off in all sorts of directions, but then incapable of doing anything other than returning to where it's tied, in the very same way, the mind can be, its tendency is to go wherever it wants, but it can be anchored to something that draws it back. And the thing we can anchor the mind to is the breath. The mind, dear boy, says this sage, talking to his son, Udalaka Rumi, he says, your mind is tied to your breath. Shvetaketu, you must see this, and then you will be wise. So what does this mean? Well, this is a very powerful tool that's made available to us through the earliest description of yoga practice, what becomes known as pranayama, control of the breath, manipulating breathing. But in its subtlest form, it's really very simple. Never mind, closing nostrils, holding the breath in for long periods, developing complicated rhythms that we maintain for a very long period. The Bhagavad Gita says the essence of this pranayama practice is very straightforward. It's to give the mind something to focus on that's in the body, as we were doing when we were sitting. So it's making the external sensations stay outside, so no interest in what the senses are telling us, not listening to what's happening next door, wondering if there's something better to be doing, smelling what's cooking, etc. Instead, just looking inwards. There, the fixed point to gaze at is up between the eyebrows, so closing the eyes, looking inwards and upwards, but really you can focus anywhere within anchoring attention on one point and then making the inhalation and exhalation equal. So just for a moment, I'm just going to suggest we pause, give that a very quick go. It's something you can maybe play with for homework. Obviously, we breathe at different rates, so I don't want to count you through a rate that's not necessarily comfortable. The whole aim is to sit comfortably, find a rhythm that works naturally for the lungs. But let's just sort of sit for a moment and let's say counting inwards for 4, outwards for 4. So inhaling, exhaling. Inhaling, exhaling, inhaling, exhaling, and all that time keeping the mind anchored where it is. So I'll leave you to experiment with that at your own pace, but just to say it's simple. It's not something that takes a lot of learning. It really just slowing the breath down, paying attention to the felt experience inside the body, not in the mind. Focusing up between the eyebrows gets perilously close to the eyes. Perhaps descending awareness even lower makes it easier to go into the body rather than the mind. But that's the aim. Just steadying the breath will steady the mind. Ultimately, though, we're trying to change the way we see the world. Yoga is about knowledge. It's about a whole new way of understanding. And the simplest expression of it in some ways is right here in this sutra from the Yoga Sutras. Sutra is a very condensed statement, almost impossible to understand without somebody's commentary to unpack it for us. So I've got here on the screen a bit of both. We've got a very pithy line: from contentment, supreme happiness is attained. Sounds almost tautological. If you're content, surely you're happy. But the explanation that comes in the commentary that goes with the sutra gives us a little bit more insight into what's being described here. The pleasure that comes from love in this world, so the enjoyment of intense sexual interaction is at the same time, like the pleasure of the highest realms of heaven, not worth 1/16 of the happiness that comes from destroying desire. Destroying desire sounds quite militant and aggressive, going to war with ourselves. That's not really what's being described here. It's that letting go of the need for the world to be a particular way allows the heart to soften, to open, to expand, to fill the body with good feelings. It feels good to not need anything other than what we have right now, to be okay with the world as it is just now. There might be problems, there might be things we need to do in a few minutes, but can we feel okay right now, in this body, in this moment? That's the subtle message of yoga. And perhaps that moment can start to be followed by another moment, and then another moment, and starts to permeate our whole approach to the world. And the word used for contentment in that sutra is santosha, and there are various sort sort of alternative arrangements of the same Sanskrit components in other yoga texts. And here's a line from the Bhagavad Gita that sort of expands again on the idea. It's a slightly different formulation. Santushto, one who is content with whatever comes to him, transcending the dualities. Again, this message, not needing it to be good, bad, whatever. Free from envy, constant in mind, whether in success or in failure. Even though he acts, he is not bound. Well, there's a long digression I could make at this point on the theory which is being described here of karma yoga and the problem of karma that yoga was developed to solve. We don't need to go into all of that right here, right now. If you want to read more about the philosophy of yoga, those are worthy subjects to dive into. But the message is very simple. It's if we can, in this moment here, be able to accept things as they are just right now, there is the possibility of this contentment that is transformative, taking root in us. And the root word of this sort of construction, the santosha, and there were santushta, is this verbal root from Sanskrit tush, which says, maybe a bit small to read the text from the dictionary here, but it says to become calm, to be satisfied or pleased with anyone or anything. It's a radical shift in mindset, accepting, embracing the world just the way it is. There's a modern version of it that you may have come across that became very popular, hyped through the rafters by Oprah Winfrey, with fairly good reason, to be honest. Eckhart Tolle makes a pretty good summary of a lot of the old yoga texts, combining a bit of Buddhism with the message of Vedanta and the Upanishads, a hint of the Yoga Sutra in there. Same story, put into modern English. Whatever the present moment contains, accept it as if you had chosen it. Now, of course, that can sound a bit triggering because some of what the present moment contains is not what we might want to choose. It's things that we would much rather change than choose. But yoga doesn't remove the possibility of change. Change can happen. But right here, right now, we can't change the past. The past has created the present moment circumstances. Are we able to stand here right now, freed from the need for it to be any other way than it is, so that we can respond skillfully to what's in front of us? Perhaps then there are the seeds of something different in the future that can be sown. But if all we're doing is running around complaining that the present moment isn't the way we wanted it to be, we're wrapping our legs behind our necks again. And the same message, it comes through in a lot of texts. I've got here a book that this is quoting from. It's available online, free in a PDF, if you want to go looking for it. Abundant, exalted, immeasurable. Concept that, again, permeates most of the yoga traditions. It's expressed very clearly in some of the Buddha's discourses, which is what's being described here. But also in the Yoga Sutra, there are hints of it. What we now know as loving kindness, perhaps. The Buddha talked about metta, and the Sanskrit term maitri, friendliness, really. Whether you're focusing on loving kindness or anything else, what matters is how you're paying attention to it. When we were sitting at the beginning, I was really saying, just let things be, settling into the body, not trying to make it a certain way, not trying to sit up straight. The quality of the attention that we pay to things, this Buddhist monk is explaining, is what defines our experience. So if the quality of attention we're paying is one of frustration, desiring the world to be other than what it is, then all we get back is irritation. So we decide we want to be filled with loving kindness, and instead noticing how annoying the world is, how frustrating our circumstances are. That's okay. What matters is how we respond to that feeling. How are we holding that feeling? What's actually coming up in the mind? How are we relating to it? How are we layering the experience? So that's where the real kindness is having what he calls a sense of non-contention, allowing the world to be, letting go of a need for it to be any other way. Oh, okay, this is what's coming up. Well, that's all just stuff that I don't have to deal with right now. I can just come back to what I'm trying to do in this moment, this training exercise of paying attention to whatever it is, the breath, walking, the flow of awareness, simply just sitting, feeling the body where it is. Anything that can take us out of that stream of thoughts that's frustrated with how the world is. So that's immediately accessible somehow, tuning out of the mind and into the body. That's a consistent message from all the different traditions, and it's echoed in all sorts of funny places. Rudyard Kipling, who was obviously inspired by the yoga traditions of India, wrote a famous poem, If, and there's a line from it here posted above the entrance to the centre court at Wimbledon in London. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, ... yeah, you will be a happy person, as the Bhagavad Gita, where he got the idea from, puts it. Here we have Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, both winning, I think, 20 Grand Slams each. So, they've had plenty of success, but not every time. So part of the way you achieve a successful mindset is to be okay with losing sometimes, to be able to just continue. The aim is to do what you do as well as you can, not to win or lose. Not to care about winning or losing, although obviously competitive sportsmen are probably quite caught up in the idea. But the basic message, though, is if we can be detached a little bit, even just a little bit, in our involvement with life, then we're less caught up in these three problems: passion, fear, and anger. We've come across them already in this expression of desire, wanting the world to be a certain way, being afraid that it won't be, getting angry when it isn't. That's when our wisdom is steady. That's the basis for engaging more constructively. So what happens when we don't feel that way? Well, the Yoga Sutra is pretty clear. It says, you don't have to be caught up in the contents of your mind. We're not our thoughts. We're something subtler than that can witness our thoughts and perhaps experiment with alternative ways of looking at the situation. It's not just the power of positive thinking. In fact, it's something completely different. It's much subtler. When we have these sort of negative tendencies bubbling up, text says we should contemplate the opposite. The reason for that is that they're the seeds of our misery, violence, and so forth, the sutra says. They're preceded by these tendencies. So the way that we act is conditioned by our state of mind. So if we're allowing ourselves to indulge these hot feelings of agitation, we're sowing the seeds of future misery for ourselves and for others. Because these tendencies produce the infinite fruits of suffering and ignorance, one should contemplate the opposite. Well, of course, it sounds lovely, easier said than done, you might imagine, and I'd be inclined to agree. There's an article that looked in very great detail at this, couple of sutras explores, puts it, well, can we just meditate on the opposite, ignore how we feel and hope things go away? And even if that works in the short term, these emotions are going to come back and haunt us until we're willing to explore them, see them for what they are, and perhaps heal the wounds that are lying behind them. Of course, then we've got another problem. We're sometimes consumed by our own suffering to the extent that we even feel bad for feeling bad, because it's clear there's other people out there in the world who are suffering too. But we can't then just positively think ourselves out of this in the hope that it will all go away if we can't first help ourselves. And how can we help ourselves if we don't start by acknowledging our suffering? We have to actually look it in the face, feel it for what it is. And somehow that's got the capacity to neutralize it if we don't identify with it, if we're not seeing it as us, as a thought that we're conditioned by. Instead, it's just something we can perhaps experiment with. The idea of opposites being integrated is contained within this concept of yoga, particularly in the traditions that speak of yoga as union or uniting things, integrating into a bigger whole, accepting that there's actually a much broader perspective on life in which we can try these things on for size. I could feel hot and angry. I could see what that does to me. Or I could experiment with the complete opposite of that, some wonderful, blissed out, lovely feeling. Maybe the truth's somewhere between the two, but not feeling that my response to the world is automatic. I'm not a robot. I'm capable of allowing this stuff to flow through me, and perhaps then choosing with some skill how to respond. And that's basically the message of modern mindfulness, allowing ourselves to feel what we feel, but being friendly enough that we wonder whether we really want to suffer more, or whether there's a way of suffering a little bit less. Is there something we can do to allow ourselves to sit with our pain and perhaps even dissolve it? And this message, it comes from the strangest sources sometimes. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning, in which he said the same thing. It's the fundamental freedom, even in the most abysmal of circumstances that you can possibly imagine. It's this one, to choose your attitude in response to any set of circumstances, to be able to choose your own path. it's different for all of us. There's no prescription. There's no one size fits all message of yoga for your life that I can give you. We find it for ourselves, but there is the capacity to choose. That's the great gift that we still have that no one can take away from us. And there's a way of putting it that I've got here a quote from BKS Iyengar, a modern yoga teacher, died a few years ago in India, but lived to the ripe old age, I think, of 94. And he's really expressing something that you might have come across in another context, something that's known as the serenity prayer. I think it says something like, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change those that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. And he's given that same concept a yogic spin. Yoga teaches us to cure what we need not endure, and at the same time to endure what we cannot cure. Sometimes some things can't be changed. Look, we've talked about Auschwitz, go into other difficult things. Diagnosis of a terminal illness. What can we do? But do we have to compound it by wishing it were different? Or are we able to find the capacity to expand our vision to the point that we can accept just enough to make the most of what we still have left? Yoga teaches us how to use the affected part so that we can function with ease. Even if that affected part is our whole body, it's still possible to find a little bit more ease in our experience of it. And this is where we get to the real core of it all, going back to the Upanishads. The whole point is to look beyond the mind, look beyond the body, look beyond the experience of pleasure or pain. We should be looking to the perceiver of it all, the witness of all experience. It is not the mind that a man should seek to apprehend, says the Kaushitaki Upanishad. Rather, he should know the one who thinks. So standing behind this experience of turbulence, the coming and going of things that frustrate us, just seeing the world as it is. And this capacity to witness is very powerful, just to be able to sit there, to let it all bubble through us, to feel it for what it is without telling a story about it, without turning it into the next scene in the never-ending movie of me and my life that we love to delight ourselves with behind our eyelids. Instead, just feeling it in the body, letting it come and go, the feeling of what we feel, rather than the thought about the feeling of what we feel. And the Buddha, again, he had a very simple sort of binary system for dealing with life. He talked about these two potentials, that which is kusala or akusala, and Sanskrit, similar to the Pali language in which these teachings were composed, has a similar phrase, as we'll see in the next slide. All things can be classed in these two ways. In this translation, it's talking about wholesome and unwholesome, but really, it's also about skillfulness and unskillfulness. That which is conducive to misery is what's unwholesome. That which is conducive to freedom is what is wholesome. Greed, hatred, and delusion lead to harm and suffering, while their removal brings well-being and happiness. So the Buddha was always saying, trying to figure out in life what is helpful, what is unhelpful. It's all we're doing in each moment. What can I do to unwind the suffering in me that I have some capacity to control? And what am I doing that's making it worse? And can I stop doing that? It's basically the question. And that's what the Bhagavad Gita says. Yoga is skill in action. It's a Sanskrit version of the same word, kaushalam, skill in action. And what should we do in action? Well, this is where the message starts to get much more expansive again, in case we're starting to think yoga is totally self-centered, transcending this personal worldview, transcending this fixation on me and my problems, feeling them for what they are, healing them as best we can, but also engaging with the world, not disappearing into the cave, acting without attachment, as the Bhagavad Gita puts it, intending to maintain the welfare of the world, being of service to our fellow beings, being able to be in relationship with others without being somewhat limited, contracted, afflicted by our negative experience. Instead, perhaps being opened up by it, feeling compassion for ourselves in our suffering, and through that compassion for the world, able to serve the world in action. And this, again, goes all the way back to the early Upanishads. The Buddha had a slightly different spin on things. The early Upanishads were talking about finding this timeless Atman, the non-changing self within us that is all things. The Buddha span it differently, saying there is no self, but there is all things. So in the end, it's two different paths to a similar perspective on the world. There is all things and they're interconnected. And the Chandogya Upanishad says this Atman, this self of mine that is deep within my heart, is, although on the one hand the tiniest thing I can imagine, smaller than a grain of rice or barley, smaller than a mustard seed, smaller even than a millet grain or a millet kernel, and yet at the same time it's larger than the earth, larger than the space between the earth and the heavens, larger than all of the sky, all of those three worlds put together. It is all things. So if I'm going to look after myself, if I'm going to take care of my own suffering and try to heal myself, the ultimate message of the yoga tradition, really, if we're thinking about living in the world, is that I'm in a relationship with everybody else, and that healing perspective radiates out in all directions. As the Buddha put it, I will abide pervading the all-encompassing world with a mind imbued with loving kindness. And that's where the title of this book I was holding up comes from. It's abundant, exalted and immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. So if we're thinking about what is this thing, loving kindness, it's about removing that tendency of this ill will, this hatred in a way of other people and the world for what it's thrown at us. Instead, are we able to say, it's okay, I mean, we don't have to like everything in the world, it's just, are we going to make our situation worse by getting wound up about that, blaming others for the situation, ranting and raving? Or are we going to try and heal? As the Buddha put it, if you've got an arrow in you, are you going to start complaining about who fired it? Or are you going to think about, how can I get this arrow out of me so that I don't suffer more? That's the question. And loving kindness is the balm that really liberates us, I think, from this contracted view of me and my misery. As is explained in this text, there's a very nice description of loving kindness meditation, and I'll talk us through a little approach to it in a moment. But just as he's sort of articulating it here, as we were sitting at the beginning, feeling at ease, then there is this capacity to pay attention that we're cultivating. Mindfulness is there also, and with that mindfulness, we just dedicate ourselves to one simple message: may I abide in well-being. The message of this session, really. And just breathe in and out with that feeling. Actually feel it. It's not an idea, it's not an abstraction that we're trying to wrap our heads around. So we're just trying to actually feel in our bodies the well-being radiating from the heart. Allow the heart to resonate around that sincere wish. And it's a challenging one for a lot of us, we don't necessarily feel like we deserve to abide in well-being. Let's be honest. We have all these stories about, why we don't, but we can. May I abide in well-being. May I abide in happiness. May I abide in freedom from suffering and discomfort, whether that's mental, physical, any kind of suffering. Allow that to be actually an energy within the body and the mind. Allow that energy to flow through and permeate the whole body. So that's the first stage of this loving kindness meditation. But ultimately, it's about something much, much more. It's about flowing out from oneself to the rest of the world, acknowledging that we are caught up in the world and we can't separate ourselves. No man is an island, as it has been said. But in the various ways that yoga has explored this concept, one message keeps coming through, and that's the more I'm contracted into myself, the more suffering there will be. The more I can expand my perspective beyond this limited fixation on my problems, the easier it is to feel better in myself and then feel better in relation to others. So I'm just going to talk us through a little practice related to that, just to bring the session to a close. A little loving kindness meditation. So again, just settling into your posture, feeling, if you want to close the eyes, do. If not, just turning the head down, but feeling comfortable in yourself, allowing yourself just to relax into the body. And then either repeating in your mind after me, or just allowing the words to soak through you as a feeling, not as an idea. May I be happy. May I be peaceful. May I be well. May I be free from hostility and anxiety. May I be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And now I'd like you to turn your mind to somebody very dear to you, thinking of a friend or a loved one, a family member, anybody who you have a really strong, warm feeling towards. May they be happy. May they be peaceful. May they be well. May they be free from hostility and anxiety. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And now, turning our minds to somebody who we feel neutral about, somebody we maybe see at the shop on a daily basis, or the bus stop, or wherever it may be, somebody we recognise but have no particular strong feeling about. May they be happy. May they be peaceful. May they be well. May they be free from hostility and anxiety. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And now, turning our minds to somebody who pushes our buttons, somebody we find in some way challenging, a difficult person in our lives. May they be happy. May they also be peaceful. May they be well. May they be free from hostility and anxiety. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And now finally, the heart as wide as the world. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. May they be well. May they be free from hostility and anxiety. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Now allowing that feeling to radiate out from the body into the space around you. Loving kindness, first and foremost for ourselves, and through ourselves for the world. And then taking just a moment to relax again into the body and gently open the eyes. So that's a little taster of some of the aspects of the yoga tradition that relates to living yoga as as an orientation to the world, a way of being, perhaps a way of recharging, so that we're better able to face the world. And in relation to that, been asked a few questions which I'm going to respond to now, and try and take us through a couple of examples of ways in which we might find answers for ourselves. First question: in these very stressful times, is there a quick fix posture or breathing technique that can help to calm nerves? Stress is ever present at the moment, and I think there are some very simple techniques. We've looked at a couple of them in passing, but there's one in particular I really want to focus in on here to bring us back to the idea of what we've got within us as a always accessible toolkit. And I'm going to take you to what's presented in the classroom to young people here in the UK. There's an organisation called the Mindfulness in Schools project, and I wrote my master's degree dissertation on their curriculum, and one of the aspects of this curriculum is known as a 7-Eleven, which is not an all-night convenience store, but a technique for breathing in such a way as to calm the nervous system. And what it really refers to is lengthening the exhalation, making the exhalation longer than the inhalation. So because children are often quite agitated, mind all over the place, moving very quickly, speaking very quickly, the breath moves faster. So counting 7 as you inhale can seem a very long time if you go very slowly, and 11 as you exhale. But the basic principle is just to make the exhalation longer than the inhalation. So before we were just experimenting with breathing in for 4, out for 4. There is a general concept, it's known in pranayama techniques as samavritti, the balancing, the evenness of in and out. That's in itself very grounding, very, very, very soothing. But to go that stage further, making the exhalation even longer, it's settling us into the relaxation impulse within us. A deeper inhalation with a shorter exhalation would do the opposite. It brings us into a sort of state of readiness, alertness, almost into fight or flight mode. We're trying to tune out of that, do the inverse, take us into a relaxed state. So if there's something that I could really recommend, not necessarily to say this app is the answer, but if you do want something you can work with at home, there is a freely available app available for both iOS and Android. You can get the link to download it from Eddie Stern, who's a New York-based yoga teacher's website, eddiestern.com, and the thing you're looking for, you can find it also in those stores, the breathing app. He's got some rhythms set up to find what he calls this resonance frequency, this capacity to tune us into the relaxation instinct. So you can measure your own capacity for breathing and then set a ratio, and then just practice for a minute. Even a minute has a really powerful effect of grounding us, settling us, and all that the app does is play one sound as you inhale and a different sound as you exhale. If you don't want the sound, you can just watch this ball expanding as you inhale and slowly receding again as you exhale. So that's I think one really, really helpful thing you can do. Focus on the breath. Another thing, if you want a posture, lie down. It's been said in many different ways over the years. I mean, again, I'm quoting here from the Mindfulness in Schools curriculum, just to show how easy it can be. They reframed the idea of meditation as meditation. Just lie down, relax, let it all go. Stop trying to control the experience. Let go of the idea that anything needs to be a particular way, and just allow the body here now to soften. And it said in the texts on physical yoga that adopting this position, lying on the ground like a corpse, they call it, it removes fatigue. It's restorative. And so the essence of restorative yoga practice is really to lie down and find a comfortable position in which you can breathe easily, softening any tension that there is. So that's probably the easiest thing to do. Get reclined and part by part soften the body. Make it easier to inhabit. Then it's harder for the mind to throw up its distractions and agitations if the body is calm. So back to another question. Is pranayama integral to yoga? Well, I really say, it's I'd even go beyond saying it's integral to yoga. It was defined in that early description we saw from the Mahabharata as the essence of yoga. Yoga is meditation, is really the message of the old text, but there is a physical approach to meditation, which is to work with the breath. This goes right back to the very earliest of India's sacred texts, the Vedas. The Atharva Veda describes a word which is used both for the breath and the life force in the body, prana, is the Lord of all things, both those that breathe and those that don't. It's the animating presence in us. It's that within which all things are established and should be honoured. We should pay homage to breath, says that chapter of that text. But more practically, we go to a text here from recent times by two scholars with whom I studied at SOAS in London, really experts on the history of yoga, Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton. In their book Roots of Yoga, they say this is the defining practice of physical yoga until very, very recently. The Buddha did it. It's mentioned, as we've seen in the Mahabharata, as one of the two kinds of meditation. It's one of the 8 parts of yoga in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. We'll look at that in a minute. It's also included in all the yoga systems of Tantra. And really sort of crowning glory when Kalidasa was trying to summarize Shiva's meditation in a poem in the 5th century, he devoted a whole verse to the mastery of breath control. It's synonymous with being a yoga practitioner until very recently. These days, the thing that's synonymous with being a yoga practitioner is looking fancy in contortions, in an Instagram-friendly pose. Whereas in pre-modern India, the defining practice of physical yoga was breath control. So this power of prana within us, the capacity with it to still the mind, is really the thing that comes up again and again. And here's one example plucked at random from a medieval compilation on physical techniques, the Hatha Pradipika, from maybe the 15th century. When the breath is unsteady, the mind is unsteady. However, when the breath is steady, then the mind can become steady. So the yogi attains stability by this means. Absolute no-brainer. One should control the breath. Working with the breath, we can control the mind. The ultimate aim of yoga is beyond the mind. If we want to get anywhere, we've got to have some tool that can still the mind. Giving it something to focus on is really the technique. And the breath, ever present, always there, coming and going, allows us to tune out of the brain and into the body. So final question, how effective are very short periods of meditation? Well, since the aim of yoga is to stop the mind, meditation really means adopting a state of mind where it's focused at first, and ultimately there is no need for the mind to do anything. The mind disappears. And so it sounds like you have to be very advanced for that to happen. But there's periods throughout the day where the mind is quiet. Paying attention to those, I think, is really powerful. So it might even be a fraction of a second. Following the out breath into a little stillness and noting that there's a little bit of a pause before you need to inhale again. That's one little portal into it. But all through the day, maybe we're just absorbed in what we're doing and the mind's quiet. That's effective. And the Bhagavad Gita has a very simple message. It says, every little bit of practice is useful. Even a little of this discipline protects one from great danger. So, I would say the texts are really encouraging us again and again. Do some. It's helpful. Even just shifting our mindset, a fraction stops us from compounding our suffering and gives us a little bit more potential to unwind it. And that's really the message of yoga. So on that note, I should hand back to Lakshmi and say thank you very much for your one-pointed focus.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was absolutely, and like Daniel said, just a little bit of mind practice takes you a long way. Perhaps if some of our leaders sort of practice that, it would help them, ground them. But Daniel, I have a question of you before we ask Lakshmi to wrap it up today. How did you come to yoga? How did yoga find you?
It's a long story. I spent some time in India as a backpacker, and I encountered some of the really old school yogis, the dreadlock sadhus sitting around fires. I went to the Kumbh Mela in Allahabad in 2001, and at that time I bought Light on Yoga by Iyengar, but I'd never found the self-discipline to actually do any of the practices. And it was only a few years later when I'd tried meditation. I'd failed to maintain much focus with it, and I was beating myself up for not being very good at it. I was stressed. I used to work in a very stressful job. I was a foreign correspondent. I was jumping on planes at a moment's notice. I got burned out, and I suddenly realized, I'd had seeds of this that I've been exposed to, and if I could just give them a little bit of space to grow, and if I went to a regular yoga class a couple times a week and started trying to do a little bit by myself, I just felt better. It became a no-brainer after that, but it had to first have space to grow, and I didn't allow it in the first instance. I was too busy with my mind and my own ideas of what I needed to be doing to have space for something involving stepping aside from the mind.
And thank you for sort of putting it into context that yoga in its inception was just sitting and being, and didn't necessarily involve all the contortions that have now been considered as part of the whole yogic tradition. Could you give us a little sort of historical overview of when that change happened and it went from just being or in one place and being within to the contortions that we now consider yoga to be across its different forms?
It's a very good question, and I have to be honest, I don't think we have a definitive answer. I was just listening actually to Jim Mallinson, who's probably the world expert on the subject, speaking just this week, and he's increasingly clear in his mind that it happened 1,000 years ago. There was really an innovation at that time. I think, I'd be a little bit more circumspect. We don't have any evidence before that point of complex postures being taught as part of yoga practice. Moving from one to another even is something much more recent. But we do have evidence of people doing things that were called tapas in an earlier period. So adopting a difficult position and maintaining it for a long time. Perhaps the classic one, stick both arms above your head and never take them down. It's incredibly arduous, or stand on one leg. So those, the Buddha talked about doing some of these austerities. Alexander the Great, 2,300 years ago, his army encountered these naked philosophers, as he called them, adopting difficult positions. But as a coherent thing that's called yoga, we have textual information about. It's really 1,000 years ago it starts to emerge. And the very first texts that teach arm balances, they say actually that's the lowest posture. The best one is to sit in Padmasana or Siddhasana and disappear. The ultimate aim of yoga, even in the systems that teach the postures, is to go beyond the mind. So using the body as a way to get absorbed in yourself to the capacity, extending the capacity to sit and ultimately disappear into greater expanded awareness. That's what the postures are for. They're not supposed to be an end to themselves until more recently, but that's become its own system. Feeling better in one's own body is already a good way to be, a part of the solution rather than the problem in the world. So I wouldn't wish to suggest that modern yoga is somehow inauthentic, but the shifts that produce it are really, in that case, maybe only 100 years old. A lot of experimentation in early 20th century India developed a new approach, and that went global, and we've all seen it today.
Well, going back all the way to the Ramayana as well, Ravan was supposed to have stood and done penance, and that's when he was granted the boon, and even before that. But yes, James Mallison's many talks on how it came into being and it became such a physical form is very fascinating. And the last, not so much a question but a comment, Daniel. You talked about breathing, and we all know that finally the body is the breath, and the breath is the body. And I personally, I've done an experiment when my blood pressure has been high, and I've done my 3 breathings from in and out and 3 together. It's come down from sort of 170, 130 to 130, 90. Pretty much at the end of a few minutes of, just 9 cycles, not even more than that.
Wow.
So thank you, Daniel, for this incredible talk, and over to Lakshmi to conclude today's session. And I do hope everybody's feeling more relaxed, and you will enjoy your glass of red wine even better at the end of
Fair enough. Thank you, Sanjay.
I'm still processing. I don't even know if I can conclude the session, but Daniel, thank you for that. That was wonderful. And I think so relevant, considering how everyone is so stressed with COVID. I mean, most people are. So that was a wonderful and very relevant session. So thank you for that. And for all of you out there who are watching, thank you for tuning in. Thank you very much. Don't go away, because we've got something tomorrow and day after and the day after. So tune in. Tomorrow is, contrary to this session, it's indulgence. We have Zyka, food, creativity, and lockdown. So we have Chef Piku and Chef Romy Gill in conversation with Sanjoy Roy. And they're going to be discussing the nature of the craft. They're going to be sharing lockdown recipes, very different from today's session, but diverse programming is what India by the Bay is about. So tune in definitely tomorrow. We hope to see you there. In the meantime, all of you stay well, stay safe, stay healthy, stay tuned. And we'll see you tomorrow, same place, same time. Thank you and good night.
Don't